Yeah. So, talking about musical intervals, we are very much used to the idea that we have a right. We have keys. We have these octaves, and then we have subdivision of the octaves into the black and white keys. So an octave really is the idea that you kind of have sort of the same note, right? You kind of it has the same name if you think about this in terms of the musical notation. It will be C, and it has a number or some kind of a little uh, kind of a comma next to it, which also designates which octave it is. So each, sorry, this is the C. So this will be one octave. That's the second octave, and so on. Middle. Some call it,
We
middle.
can't
And
we
oh,
can't hear anything.
you cannot
I mean, we
hear.
can't hear the keyboard.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course I did. So let's try again. Can we hear it now?
Yeah.
Perfect. So anything here. So I think everybody kind of like can sense and perceive that this is kind of the same note in some sense, but has something like an octave above. I mean, there is one way to think about this as a spiral music representation, which is also a common way to think about this in kind of geometrical way. That something happens in the frequency that sort of makes it sound a little bit the same, but of course different. And I don't know, I didn't prepare that, I don't want to pull up any slides, but if I have spiral tonality or something, let me, chroma representation, I'm sure I can find very quickly. Yeah, so kind of the idea, I know which one, spiral array. Yeah, Alan Chu has this idea of, let me see if I can find quickly just a graphical notation. So we have the notes, right? And this is the circle of fifth, right? C, G, D, A. That those who kind of studied music theory probably are familiar with. So why we actually choose to arrange notes in such a strange way? Because normally, when we think about tonality, uh, we talk about going through, C, okay, and then we have, or if we start, this is usually A, okay, and don't ask me right now why we actually start here with A and note this is A, but that's a convention. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and A again, okay? Or from C to C, that starts C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So this is kind of the usual way of arranging musical keys, and these would be sharps or flats. So C and C sharp, or sometimes you can say this is not C sharp, it can be D and D flat, and they overlap in that sense. Um, and, and of course, you can have slightly different tuning systems that we don't use anymore, or actually make a distinction between sharp and flat. But this is kind of the common thing. So why we want to go and look into a circle of a fifth, which is kind of strange because you go C and then G and then D and then A. Okay, or if I go from here, okay. And I have the chat where I was going. I think I had F. Why we do that? Well, there is some kind of a sense that this and this, they sound together nicely, right? Or maybe if you take the lower notes, it will sound even more. And these are kind of piano sampling recordings, so maybe I can even play them together. I think, yeah. So this versus this is an octave. You can even hardly hear that there are two notes playing because they blend. They blend nicely. So everything octave apart, in some sense, is blended because it has a lot of basically overlapping overtones. And then we rank them somehow in terms of some sort of a consonance. So from C to G is a fifth. And we'll talk about why it sounds nice. And then G to D also will sound nice because the interval between G and D will sound nice, and so on. You can, of course, not follow the same route and put them sequentially in terms of just how the frequency emerges. But the spiral interpretation, where is that? I don't know if I have some kind of a nicer, is that, no, I don't think this is a good representation of the spiral. Sorry, let me just kind of go back and find this idea that, yeah, maybe the pitch helix. So what we have here, we actually arrange them just in a sequential order, like you have on the keyboard, C, C sharp, D, D, and so on. But then the thing is that as you go up in pitch, you basically switch in octaves. So you'll have here, just because the D sharp was on the edge, here you have D sharp, then you have D sharp on an octave above and 2 octaves above. So in some sense, these are pitch classes, but as you go up on the keyboard, they start going up, and this will be basically changing the octaves, changing the registers. So this is kind of one way to think about tones. Now going back to the question of tuning. Okay, so what is it about the tuning of this interval that makes it more consonant than maybe other tones, right? So, you know, these two, as we said, that sounds consonant. We also might consider this as consonant, right? Or even this, okay? But this is probably dissonant, right? This doesn't sound pleasant. And a lot of attention over the years, and then also a lot of musical theory, especially kind of in the early polyphonic writing, two-voice writing, was kind of not happy with this interval. Now, actually, kind of the idea is if you play this, then you're gonna have to resolve it. Okay? So what's so special about these intervals? That these are kind of the nice and harmonious, while anything that goes here, okay, that has to be resolved. And eventually, kind of you can follow the same logic and try maybe, and it's kind of funny for me to try to play this, but, and then you would go and resolve it to this. So there's kind of, yeah, there's too much of a pedal here, but kind of the idea that you go and take one chord and then resolves to another chord, which is kind of very, very powerful and a common chord sequence in popular music, classical music, from 5 or 5 in this case is a dominant 5 because it has, and it's being resolved into this. So part of the reason that you know, it's such a powerful pulling force towards resolution is because this tritone, this is a tritone, okay? And if you calculate what tritone has, is like you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 semitones. It's same thing like going from C to F sharp. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So this is a tritone. what happened to my cue? Oh, sorry. And then it's resolved into, well, like here. So sorry. Oh, okay. So you have this tritone from E to this. This goes half a step, and this goes half step down. So making this kind of two-headed motion, you kind of take this horrible interval and you resolve it here. So I mean, that kind of a logic was really elaborated more and more into rules of counterpoint and harmony eventually. So we devoted some time to trying to explain, well, what is it? I mean, do we have any kind of physical, acoustical, rational explanation that is not just purely cultural? And the idea is that, first of all, understanding the fifth. What is the relation of the fifth? So I think in the notes in class, I do explain that if you look at the physics, basically, on the spectrum, the overtones of a complex sound. So if you have note which is not a pure sine wave, but something that has a lot of frequencies, anything that has the sensation of pitch, anything that has a sensation of periodic sound, that's what makes it different from noise. It actually repeats itself, and that idea that if you have something that is repeating, it could be a very complex waveform. It can be now mathematically, acoustically, whatever you want. Helmholtz put little bottles of resonance to show his spectral analysis in the early before Fourier stuff. You can see that it has like these frequencies that are multiples of the fundamental. So kind of an easy way to try to convince you that this is the fact is just synthesizing something. So let's generate, I won't be doing, well, let's be tone, we don't need chirp, 400, whatever, okay. And let's, instead of, so sine wave will be just one frequency, but let's put something like a sawtooth, okay. And we get this note, okay. And if I want to, sorry, let's zoom in. Yeah, okay, yeah, zoom in. It's one, right? So we have this sawtooth wave, and if we want to look at this in the frequency domain, you have these lines here, which might not be looking very, very convincing, but you have a lot of lines. These are the partials, and if I go back to the waveform, and I'll kind of zoom out a little bit. If I take now a section of this sound, right, and I do an analysis in terms of frequency, plot spectrum, and I want to do this on a linear scale. So now it looks to you like a physics class. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. And since I think I didn't do this, let me kind of redo this. I'll try to be careful to grab really a period. So I'll start in a place and I'll end exactly so I don't get like any artifacts or minimal artifacts. Analyze plot spectrum. What happens too little? I need, yeah, okay, that looks good. So of course you need a little bit of a, and it's still, even then, it's not like a perfect image, but you can see that what we have, are these peaks, okay, and the Audacity actually shows you on the cursor what the frequency of the peak is. Okay, so this is the peak, okay, look at the right here. So we see that the first one is 395 hertz, the second peak is 805, 1205, 1595. Maybe it's not ideal, okay? I can try to, if I do this with a slightly different window, it'll be smoother, but you can kind of see that they're, ideally, mathematically, they should be exactly multiples, okay? So it should have been 400, okay? That's what I wanted to synthesize, so the analysis shows that it's 396, okay? I think if I take a longer window or just kind of don't do this so carefully, briefly, it will better match the theory, but let's say this is almost 400. This should be 800, so it's 104. This should be 3 times, so 1200, so it's 1199. And this should be 4 times 400, 1600, right? So within certain range of tolerance, you get these values. And maybe if I increase a little bit the resolution here, now then you get a lot of artifacts from the analysis. Let's see. Yeah, this is 412, 402, 798. So as any physics lab, if anybody takes physics, you know that the measurements always are slightly off. But this is kind of the idea, is that you get these multiples. Okay, you get the fundamental frequency and you get a lot of these overtones. So now if you think about this multiple will be an octave. There's actually a way to be able to synthesize or just filter this out. So this first tone, whatever the 400 hertz, the second will be 800 hertz, it'll be an octave. The one after this will be 3 times, right? So believe me, and I think in the slides, in the lectures, I do show this kind of a scale that relates them. If you want to translate now these overtones to musical notes, and let's say your lowest note was this one. It's of course not 400, it's whatever that frequency is, okay? The octave will be this, okay? So I start with an F here, right? Well, let me start with the C, okay? C, this will be the octave. The next one, after that, 3 times this frequency will be this. And then 4 times, and then 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, approximately. I mean, this is, you have to get used to it. I mean, the reason I'm showing this because I just know this. I mean, you should verify for yourself why. But I mean, I think everybody agrees, or at least should know by now, that an octave is doubling the frequency. But then if you look at the next one, this will be the ratio of 3 times. This is 3 times, or if this is 2 to 1, and this is 3 to 1, then this is 3 to 2. Okay, so this ratio 3 to 2 is the ratio in terms of frequencies. Okay, the actual frequencies in the physical vibration between these two notes. And this is what is considered the most nicely blending sound, because all the overtones of this tone, so this note actually has elements which resonate with this note. It has elements that resonates with this note. It has elements that resonates with this note. And I cannot do this here, but in acoustic piano, I mean, there is a fun demonstration where you basically press quietly these keys. Let's say you can press quietly this key and hit this key, and then you hear that this key is playing, because all the frequency from here actually managed to resonate with this string. So, I mean, there's this idea that things that overlap nicely in terms of their frequency components also blend nicely in terms of our perception, and we feel them as sounds that merge together, while others not as much. Okay, so I don't know if there are any questions. I was kind of like just talking. Now, so the frequency of G is 3/2 times larger than the frequency of C next to it. Yes, this is why we have 1.5 ratio, which is the ratio of a fifth. Now, once you use that, then you can start playing with this idea. And really in the Pythagorean tuning, that was kind of the basic element or logic of trying now to start putting all the other intervals. So if you start, we said, let's now try kind of to select notes that will resonate nicely together, but not only pair, we need more than that. So the 12, yes, the Matthew's question, I'm kind of jumping a little bit forward. So the equal temperament actually kind of distorts that. In the equal temperament, for other purposes, for other advantages of being able to play now in all scales and stuff, the tuning was slightly off, and the ratio of 3 to 2 is slightly distorted. So we are so used to this that we don't really notice, but people who, piano tuners many times use beating, which is one way to kind of try to relate two tones together. They somehow, you can check that on the piano, a fifth is actually has a little bit of a beating. It actually is off by a little bit from the ideal 3 to 2, but that came later for other purposes. But just as the basic element, if you think about this as the fifth, and then the next one will be, okay? So now you can actually fold them back, so you'll have, right? And then, so let's just go 5 steps, okay? And if we go these 5 steps, we get a pentatonic scale, which is very typical to a lot of musical cultures. Some reason, like Japanese music tends to be kind of reaching this type of scale. Now, how to remember pentatonic scale? Well, let's do this instead of starting on C here, just for the sake of visualization and memorizing. Let's start it here. Right, so this is kind of a usual trick. People say, well, you have the pentatonic scale here on the black ones. And the beauty of pentatonic scale is that almost anything you play kind of sounds harmonious, right? You can play... Sorry. I now got totally out of this. I pressed this, but I'm trying to play the black keys. So, right, I don't know what happened here. So, you almost don't get any false notes if you just limit yourself to 5. Going on the circle of a fifth, only 5 steps, right? I think I moved out of the... Yeah, so if you go like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or any direction, select any kind of adjacent 5, it becomes a pentatonic scale. If you compose melodies in these 5 pentatonic scales, and also have maybe even multiple more voices, they kind of sound nicely harmonious. If you go and you step 2 more steps, if you want to extend it, you get the diatonic scale. You get the 7, you get the white keys. And then if you think about 5 and the 7, you get the 12. It doesn't mean that you cannot tune it differently. It doesn't mean that people are trying all kinds of alternative tunings, micropolyphony. Microtuning. Okay, you can divide the octave into a different number of intervals, but for various reasons, that seems to be a nice approximation that allowed us now to build structures like intervals, chords, and then with this little correction that the 12th tone did, you actually got to the point that now you could also now define concepts of tonality, and you can write in a key, and then you can transpose and play in a different key, and you can go back and forth, because before the 12 tones, there were slight differences in tuning if you really follow the 3-to-1 ratio. And then if you start your music with the basic interval, elsewhere, the notes will kind of not exactly overlap. And so you sort of like had maybe, the authentic tuning and a lot of the Renaissance early music, and there is a revival of this. So people actually play orchestras which were tuned according to the earlier tuning systems. It will be tuned to a specific scale. But then, with Bach and later more of a classical romantic music, when you would move from one key to another key, you wouldn't be able to retune your instrument for every key. So this is kind of a nice compromise, that the 12 tones equal temperament D, and there is kind of this simple. So the pentatonic scale is any selection of 5 adjacent notes according to the circle of fifth. C pentatonic scale, well, it depends how. There's a major and a minor, so it depends how there are some conventions, slightly different conventions of, but yeah, that will be a major pentatonic scale, because it starts with a kind of a major triad. But you can start it from any other key. Did that? I hope that answered that. I don't know if that was exactly helping all of the ratios. I mean, I didn't show all the ratios, and I'm not sure that answered exactly all the aspects of the question. But if so, feel free to ask me. But if not, I mean, since we're talking about this, and I have Audacity open, maybe I can also show a little bit, the idea of consonance and dissonance, because I think there were some questions and discussion of outside of the class about this. So let me just kind of repeat the same thing, but I'll do this now with a chirp. So what I want to do is kind of talk a little bit this idea of roughness. Yes, there was another question, Matthew. Yes, please. Do you want to, open the mic or put it in writing?
Sure.
Yes. Yeah. Go ahead.
If you want to continue with roughness, that's fine.
No.
I was just wondering how you tune. How you tune the piano from 12 tone equal temperament to Pythagorean, if you wanted to use that in future projects.
How do you tune the piano? Actually, I'm not sure I can tell you exactly, because I'm not I never tuned the piano myself. I mean, I can tell in theory that that you can use beats to kind of try to offset this, but that's actually an interesting question. I mean, practically how you tune it, what you listen to, unless you have the ratios of the frequencies, and you come with a tuning app that actually tells you the frequencies, right? But if you want to do it by ear, by beating, I'm not sure how it's done. I mean, technically, you just come with that little key and start changing the tuning, but this will be still the 12 tones, right? You're not talking about tuning into divisions which is more than 12, because then the keyboard will map differently, and people do that, but then you have kind of to rethink totally about what the meaning of the keys is. So frankly, I mean, I don't know if I don't think I really can answer your question exactly what you're asking, but you can try to find it out, or send me a question and I'll kind of maybe can find out more. Okay, offline. Well, before we run out of time, and I wanted a little bit also to mention the homework. So kind of what's going to happen next week. But I mean, I think this is an important session, because these concepts are sort of mathematical and they're sort of technical, and you might learn about them in acoustics, but then devote a whole class to this. It might be too much if people kind of just if you're not really going into sound of music. But as a basic understanding, I think it kind of grounds very well at least the basic choices people did and the motivation for creating these musical scales, because we said it's human intent. It is human intent somehow related to perception, somehow related to responses of pleasure in some sense, or the sensations themselves. And then you kind of keep on building on this, and at a certain point you build on this just by the logic of it, and not everything you immediately sense. And of course, as music becomes more and more complex, you might be totally detaching some kind of intuitive sensation from already cultural convention. So I think that kind of happens a little bit to the tritone, because if I want to generate let me generate a chirp, but take a sine wave, okay, and let's do just one octave for 30 seconds, and then I'll add a new track and generate another sine tone, just a constant one, for the same 30 seconds, okay? So if we want to look at this as a spectrogram, well, it's going to be hard to see because it's going to be only down here that you can see that there is something moving in the frequency, right? It kind of goes here because the frequency analysis goes all the way to the 8 kilohertz, because I think, okay, well, I can set up the range, but it's slightly moving up, okay, and this one should be constant. But if I play them together, okay, let me make sure that I send this to Zoom. Okay, so it's almost like a bouncing ball, right? When you start with it, you feel it as one note. Then as they move a little bit outside of that critical band, before you perceive this as two notes, so somewhere here, I'm sure you kind of hear that these are two notes. So for those musically inclined, it's kind of what it's like, about a third, a major third. But when it moves away from being one tone to two tones, it goes through this process of kind of fast beating, which can be mathematically explained, because if you add two sine waves, which are slightly in different frequency, you can actually see that they become, you have the average and you have the difference, and that difference will be this kind of a beating, which becomes faster and faster. And then at a certain point, I mean, mathematically the beating remains, but we suddenly separate this into two tones. But this transition somewhere here, right, I think, right? So if can I do this as a, put a shift, right? I would say it's not the most pleasant experience. We actually hear it as and then it moves out, okay? Now, if we go to the middle, because that will be, right, if you went here from 220 to 440, which is doubling, so I think 1.5 will be exactly in the middle somewhere here. If you're around here, that's your fifth, right? It blends pretty nicely. I think, in terms of, if we can think about some kind of a psychoacoustical experiment asking you, well, how pleasant this is, I guess for many people this will be much more pleasant than, something here. Or, even here. Why? I don't know. Maybe this modulation is kind of unpleasant to us. Now, a tritone, which is, I don't know, I have to calculate exactly where the frequency ratios are. If you listen to it just with sine waves, you know, I'll let you decide if this is pleasant or not pleasant, but I mean, the clicks are because the pitch changes and I'm kind of jumping in the loop. But you might recognize this as tritone. Personally, I don't feel this really unpleasant if you kind of forget your musical training. But if you repeat the same experiment, okay, instead of doing this, we will now go ahead and, okay, I'll try to do this with new tracks and repeat the same experiment, but this time we'll generate a chirp from 220 to 440 and use our sawtooth. Okay, didn't do this in the right place, so we'll move it. And then also create a new track and put our constant. So it was generate, right? Chirp. Constant 220. Sawtooth. And I'll put them as 2 solo. Okay. Oh, I cannot. So sorry, I cannot put them solo. I can mute the ones above and mute this one. Mute. I just want to erase them. So we have now these two sounds, and if you look at them in frequency, you can see that they have a lot of partials, right? Before that was white. Now we have all of these harmonics here, and you have all of these harmonics here, and now you'll have these beating interactions all over the place. Okay, so if we play it now. Okay, let me go ahead and do this, just making sure that the others are soloed, right? Yeah. So if you play around with the same idea, right? And now let's see if we can kind of, this will be, okay, I'm moving this and not in the right cursor. I hope I didn't move it out of the range because then all the sync will go away. Okay, so if we go now to this 1.5, right? In this case 15 because it's halfway between the 30. In this section, which should be pretty much the fifth, okay? Let me, okay. Okay, I hope you feel the sound itself is rougher, right? Because you have more harmonics, and but if you want to compare this in terms of pleasure of how well they blend compared to something here, right? Or let me go a little bit further. Or even maybe I get closer to the, sorry, I think maybe I was a little far. Getting closer to the fifth. You kind of can sense even that there is this sort of that rapid beating that happens. It just happens between higher harmonics, and you know, here will be the tritone, and this tritone, like, let's just do this transition, going from tritone to the fifth and going out. Hear that when it hits the 15 mark, which is in the middle, suddenly things kind of like jump together, right? They ease up, everything is fitting. so this is that magic where the harmonics overlap, and when you go out of that, you get this beating. So this is kind of that idea that for a lot of natural sounds, human voices, musical instruments, which are not pure sine waves, you know, right next to that ideal interval of a fifth, you get this very unpleasant effect of a lot of partials not overlapping perfectly, and when they fall within that critical band area, they start beating, creating this roughness. So this is one possible explanation for the sensations of dissonance and consonance, based on basically our sensations, based on the acoustics, and then based on the roughness as a sensation. Very long story as an answer to an innocent question, so I hope you wouldn't regret asking me questions later on. But let me stop sharing and just a little bit see if there are any other questions in that respect. Okay. So we're kind of running close to the end. I want to quickly maybe talk about next week. I don't know if I want to bring up too many things. I did mention some of this on Tuesday, so I think I have a recording. That recording I forgot to post it. So there were also questions about recordings of previous live sessions. I know that there was an issue with one of them. Actually, I had to redo the permissions twice. There are kind of too many save buttons on sharing this without password and making public that. So I hope at least the live sessions from last week and before, all of them are okay. The one from Tuesday, I did talk a little bit about a piece by Jean-Claude Risset, which is sort of taking this idea of a soundscape, but a little bit more as artistic composition, where the idea of being loyal to acoustic ecology is less important. A lot of experiments, a lot of play with ambiguity between musical sounds, synthetic sounds, or recordings of natural sounds, recordings of musical instruments, some kind of a synthetic blend of them. And that kind of brings a little bit that idea of understanding these kinds of compositions as a cognitive question. So we almost deliberately try in this class stay away from musical theory in the traditional sense. Also because there are other classes that teach that. But also, as you might have seen, this class is sort of like, I wouldn't say it's not about music, it is about music, and we're talking always about music. But, we look at music from very broad perspectives. Music, like, as a subject of study that entails anything from acoustics and physics to perception and cognition, and of course, culture and expression of culture. So, as a way of thinking, when you try to think that people using music in these very strange ways, and they now create music that blends recordings and musical instruments, and they question the whole notion of what is musical rules and musical scales, and include this, and now have this huge vocabulary of musical sounds, especially with computers that allow you now to include everything. And you can basically manipulate any sounds and make it either conforming or non-conforming to maybe more traditional musical sounds at will. Then the question is, well, how do you listen to these pieces? So there's this whole subject of study about trying to analyze, understand electroacoustic composition, these mixed compositions. And some of this theory also proliferates to actual practices, even in popular music or popular practices. Of course, once you start using, and we mentioned diegetic sounds, or the idea that sounds that happen in environments versus sounds that you add, non-diegetic sounds that actually are intended to create a mood. This whole idea of diegesis, which is a notion actually from theory of narratology. There's diegesis, there's mimesis, which is trying to imitate, and there's also this another aspect that people, when they use these concepts to describe our as the experience of listening to these very out-of-the-box compositions, you kind of start questioning yourself on the basic premise of your own cognition. So there is this digestive mimesis. There's also oral. People talk about this as discourse. Okay, so if you think about communicating music to the listener as some type of dialectic or discourse, dialectic is basically kind of like a philosophy of making sense of stuff. There's this idea that your oral perception of sound, and basically just the acoustic sense of sound is detached from anything else. It will introduce concepts of reduced listening to the sound, which kind of intentionally is detached from identifying the source of the sound, and then using sounds to imitate, so the mimetic aspects. And then, of course, sounds which are so much rooted in the sound walk that they're basically belonging to the story, and they're not used as a way to address your emotions, mood, or create an atmosphere. All of these are kind of questions that, in terms of the theory of mind, if you want to think about this, if a questions of or the idea of questioning our perception of sound are in the realm of almost philosophy or cognition. So how do we think about sounds? I mean, there are a lot of interesting theories that try to address these things. One of them really is a so-called theory of mind, okay, very basic. Sees the mind as basically part of the ecology. Mind has to perceive the world in different ways, and in that sense, how do you understand these sounds? How do you relate them not to rules of music as such, but to some almost generic aspects of your own cognition and perception? So it might be a bit of abstraction, a bit of a difficult question that you might think that maybe we're overthinking music. I mean, I totally accept that. Maybe you can say, well, this is music just as an experimental material for cognitive studies. So that's also fine. My motivation of looking at this will come much later when we think about how you maybe train computers or neural networks to understand such a complex phenomenon as sound. And in that sense, there is this idea of, how do you make sense of stuff? And many times, we say, we do this by induction, by logic, right? We try to understand things. There is this concept, which also came from theory of communications and from semiotics, which is called abduction. Now, what is abduction? Abduction, in some sense, you feel that it makes sense to you. It's not really a logical deduction that follows you. Now, in order for these things to make sense to you, you almost need to be able to imagine them. You feel that this is good approximation to something that you could hallucinate about, if you want to think about this in that sense. And today, the big surprise is that a lot of the neural networks also manage to understand complex things like images and then paintings and sounds and speech by sort of simulating them, having this kind of ability to generate their own versions of the world. And when they match, I mean, there is no really good explanation of what it is. I mean, you can, of course, look into the equations. But if you want to think about this in these large terms, they don't do logic anymore. I mean, yes, originally computation was about logic. Today, it's almost like the computers, the neural networks, build their own imagination. They build their own ability to simulate the world, and the world matches with their simulations. In some sense, they can do useful stuff. They can maybe recognize, of course, and they can eventually output a name, but they can also create other versions. So this kind of idea of abduction, if you want, sort of applies to even this question of how do you make sense of a composition like Jean-Claude Risset's suite that is on the list of basically on the musical examples in the listening room for next week. There is another aspect which I think I'll just kind of mention of performance that we are going to address next week, because we have studio work. Now, the way that studio work is designed was really to give you an opportunity to perform with someone else doing that piece, the clapping by Steve Reich. But we also created a version which you can basically do this with yourself. So I can relate this, of course, to other aspects of this kind of cognition perception, but in that sense, I think mostly it is a different experiment, a different experience, kind of getting really hands-on chance to clap and then clap with a different rhythm. And you could somehow relate this to consonance dissonance in the sense that, you know, these patterns also go out of tune and go back to tune, but really this is on a very, very different scale. So I don't want to exaggerate here with finding links between stuff, but you know, please take a look at the instructions, because there are two versions. One is just you perform with somebody else, so maybe you'll do more of a rehearsing to be able to perform this real time or perform this live. Another version is you do basically dubbing over, you know, you record one track and then you can record the second track. And also we provide some click tracks with different speeds that you can maybe use to help you to do the recording. And then it's kind of more of a production and work with Audacity, but you will be performing the recordings. So these are different experiences. They're just two alternative ways to do them. We still call them a stage. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I think we really hit the point of the end of the class. There was last question about how many locations should we use for soundwalk. As many or as little as you wish, as long as it's an interesting soundwalk. I mean, you can record your whole soundwalk in one room over, I don't know, over a day if you want. But no, we didn't really specify something, but just make a compelling story. Okay, thank you, everyone.
So in the
Okay.
soundwalk, can I have
Yes,
ask one more
yes.
question? We're
Yeah,
like,
of course.
we're not recording the entire like walk per se. If we're doing a walk, we're taking like highlights of particular sounds. If that's
Yes,
yeah,
yes, yeah. I mean, you have to condense. Technically, you will not be able to. So you choose the sounds, and you have the freedom to record them in optimal conditions, and you have the freedom to also manipulate them. Yes.
Okay. And for the Monday
All right.
assignment, studio work, do you
I mean,
actually
next week's studio work.
well, let's say this like this the live sorry, the stage session.
So this, yeah. So sorry, that's the stage session for next week, right? That's the clapping.
Yeah, this Monday.
Is that okay? Depends on your section, right?
Oh yeah, that's right. Well, I'll just email my session leader about that.
Yeah, so that one is, you have a score. You have a score, and you just have to perform it, basically. But you can either perform it live and record yourself with somebody else, or you record yourself and dub yourself offline. Basically.
So we just choose a score and we do it.
No, there is a score. It's the clapping. It's the clapping by Steve Reich.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I forgot about that. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well,
I have.
Yes. Yeah.
One more question.
Okay.
Would it
Sure.
be
Go ahead.
possible,
Yeah.
For me to stay like 2 minutes after class and just discuss my soundwalk, I want to make sure that I'm like doing something that will fit the criteria correctly.
Yeah. Okay. Let's do it. I mean, I do have something
It'll just be-
at 11, but yeah, we can definitely take the
Okay.
5 minutes after class. Yes.
So I don't know if anyone else is staying. I don't want to like keep you, but you know.
I mean, if it's totally private, we can basically switch to different Zoom. But
it's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
So I had sort of two creative things that I was unsure if it was like okay or not. Basically, the first one was I wanted my soundscape to represent what it would sound like to be almost like in my head. So I wrote a little piece of music that would kind of play under it. And is that kind of okay? So it's not like a specific, like this is a location, this is the sound for the location, but it's sort of a flowing thing that's kind of inside my head as well as noises from an actual walk, like birds or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So it sounds interesting. I mean, and as a general principle, you know, last thing we want to do is impede any of your creative intent or inspiration. Um, it it will help us to have sort of that kind of sound walk type of description, but um, it's totally fine if your sound walk is imaginary.
Okay. Yeah.
In some sense, and we do want it to include sounds which are not only musical sounds.
For sure.
So if you write a musical piece but you include these things, and it becomes sort of that kind of like lucid dream, daydream, night dream. It could be dreamlike interpretation of something else that happens. That's perfect. I mean, it's actually very, makes you curious to see what you did. But just kind of make sure that we understand where it goes, right?
Yeah. And then my second thing was I wanted the walk to be a progression, kind of like from my dorm room to a walk to the beach. And so as a progression, I kind of wanted to have the birds sounds in the background go from like land birds to like seagulls and stuff, and show kind of a progression of the walk, almost like as if, and having like from just like walking sounds to hearing waves. Is that an okay way to kind of bring a almost flow and like a journey to the walk as opposed to just kind of generic sounds?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure will you be able to find all these recordings, or you want to kind of process some sound, or you can kind of even go with creating synthetic versions and just having the references. I mean, just because we're talking about Risek, and I'll keep that in mind as an example. But he has like a lot of kind of juxtapositions of like chirps or insects, and then he's playing with all kinds of wooden chimes and stuff for similar textures, and it's totally fine if you kind of like go outside of that recording thing um, if you have an interesting sound trajectory to develop there. But showing a trajectory also by showing how the sounds change, that's definitely within. I mean, it's almost exactly what the sound work is supposed to do. Is kind of like convey the changes in sound as you move through space.
Yeah.
So I'm just yeah. So yeah. I mean, it does sound. I mean, sounds good. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. With such like because music is so subjective, I wanted to make sure like I was doing something that fit the correct parameters. So thank you for your time.
So this is what I'm saying, especially when we open this up to almost any type of sound art. It's important for us to be able to have kind of framework of reference. I mean, now everything has to be much more contextualized because we're not relying on cultural, norms or conventional forms that you encounter, right? This is why I said when I wanted to have the soundwalk and soundscape sort of related, is because it also helps us to understand more about your soundscape from reading about soundwalk. But if they become a little bit more far detached or far apart, because one goes into more imaginary, just don't be shy on adding to the description of the soundscape what you try to accomplish, because we will be reading this. Okay.
Yeah.
Exactly for the reason you mentioned. It becomes subjective. Yeah. So you need to bring me or us as listeners, as TAs, myself, into your world, so we will be able to appreciate this and not just think about this just a collection of sounds that doesn't make sense to us.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, guys.